And it's a particular pleasure this evening to welcome Malcolm Gunt. Malcolm has had quite a demanding day so far. It began with his first train being cancelled, and after he'd been driven into Norwich to get back on schedule, then lack of train crew meant that the train from Paddington paused at Swindon for long enough to ensure that he missed the connecting train from Newport to Hereford. So congratulations, first of all, on reaching that. Some of you will remember that he spoke to us at the 2017 festival, a very insightful talk on Coleridge and Traherne. Others will, of course, know him from his weekly slot on the back of the Church Times, Poets' Corner, and I know that a number of you are fans of his poetry as well. Incidentally, his most recent volume of poetry, David's Crown, uses the verse form terza rima, which is used, of course, by Dante in the Divine Comedy, and used also by Dorothy Sayers in her translation. I'm not sure whether that's relevant to anything you're going to say this evening, but I thought I'd just mention it in passing. Malcolm has also written books on the interrelationship of poetry and faith, particularly faith, hope, and poetry, and a fascinating book on Coleridge called Marrow. He also has two new books coming out, I think it must be only next week, Lifting the Veil, which explores the creative work of poets and other artists and how it can lift the veil and kindle our imaginations for Christ. And a second book, which he describes as a poet's cradle, My Theology, the Word within Words. But we're very fortunate. We don't have to wait until next week because he's with us in person. In her lecture, The Way of Affirmation, Dorothy Sayers said, the way of affirmation has received but little attention from theologians. This is perhaps just as well, for it is preeminently the way of the poets. But how valuable it is that we have both a poet and a theologian to speak to us this evening. And just before I finally pipe down, can I check, is the loop working? Yes, good, excellent. So, Malcolm Gunt to speak to us on Thomas Traherne, Dorothy Sayers, and the way of affirmation.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and Richard, also thank you for rescuing me from the station at the wrong time. Actually, I think that talking about new books, the book on which you'll be released is Richard's. I think your book on Traherne's poetry is going out. Is that also next week, or?
Well, the hardback is already available if you're feeling very wealthy. The paperback's not due until November.
Oh, anyway, so look out for that. Having said that, of course, I feel slightly in awe coming to something like the Traherne Society, because although I love Traherne, I'm not by any means an expert or a scholar in Traherne, and I'm sure some people will know far more than I do. But I am, if I'm an amateur in the full early sense of the word amateur, one who loves. And I love Traherne, and I want to share with you a sort of review and revisiting of an essay which includes thoughts on Traherne by Dorothy Sayers, which I think is superb. I think it's perhaps been neglected a little, and as it happens also to make a series of interesting comparisons between Traherne and Dante. I thought it would be good because this, of course, is the 700th anniversary year for Dante, who died on September the 14th in 1321, so it is his 700th. But before I do any of those things, I'd like to stir your memory, if I may, and ask you to recall when and where and how it was that you first came across Traherne. My guess is that it was Traherne quoted by somebody quoting another book, perhaps Traherne in an anthology. I don't think one just naturally comes to a full, 2 or 3 volume Traherne, but somehow somebody in the circle of your acquaintance or in the wider circles of your reading introduces you to Traherne. And if your experience of that was anything like mine, then it is unforgettable. You hear for the first time this distinct voice, and you hear somebody voicing things, saying things, giving words and images to deep intuitions that you may well have had yourself and felt for a long time, and somebody else has said it. I think if you're a person who's going to like Traherne at all, then your first meeting with Traherne is going to be, as they say, an aha moment. So I'm going to start this by telling you, since it's an introduction, that my first glimpse of Traherne was in this essay, The Beatrician Vision, which talks about it, by Dorothy Sayers. And it was in a book, this is the first edition of it. The book was called The Poetry of Search and the Poetry of Statement. And it was published in '63, posthumously, it was a posthumous collection of Dorothy Sayers' papers. And I had just happened upon it in the bookshelf of a friend's house when I was all of 17. And I just begun to get into dancing. In fact, the friend I was with, she and her daughter, together with me, were reading through dancing and using a bit of the Italian and using Dorothy Sayers' translation. So I saw this Dorothy Sayers, I liked the book, so I said, oh, can I have a look at this? And she said, oh, you must read The Beatrician Vision. And I sat down and read this essay, and there, in the essay, fairly early, I read these words. She says, in fact, she was very good judge, just there they were. These were the words I read. First words of Traherne I ever read. The corn was orient and immortal wheat, which never should be reaped nor was ever sown. I thought it had stood from everlasting to everlasting. The green trees, when I saw them first, through one of the gates, transported and ravished me. Their sweetness and unusual beauty made my heart to leap and almost mad with ecstasy. They were such strange and wonderful things. Boys and girls tumbling in the street and playing were moving jewels. I knew not that they were born or should die. But all things abided eternally as they were in their proper places. Eternity was manifest in the light of day, and something infinite behind everything appeared, which talked with my expectation and moved my desire. The city seemed to stand in Eden, or to be built in heaven. And then at the bottom it said, T. Traherne, Centuries of Meditations, 3.3, B. Debel's Modernist Text. But this was the first I read. And I was just astonished by it. But particularly, eternity was manifest in the light of day, and something infinite behind everything appeared. That kindled something in me. And it kindled something in me because maybe looking back into my early childhood, but occasionally I had that. I couldn't have expressed it quite like that, but I had that sense of something deeply interfused, as Wordsworth would say later, of something shining through, a translucence, a transfiguration, which didn't annihilate the particular things I saw, but made them even more deeply and beautifully themselves, and yet resplendent with something beyond themselves. And it's the kind of experience of which, when it occurs to you, you're quite shy in the first place, and in the second place, you haven't got the words for it anyway. And in the third place, particularly if you happen to be me at the kind of last gasp of the 60s and hippiedom, if you started to talk about that, either nobody would understand you, or they would say, hey man, what do you want? Can I have some? So it's quite difficult, and I didn't have words for this kind of thing, and I was a bit of an awkward teenager anyway. So suddenly, to come across this passage was astonishing. I need more Traherne. And in fact, as you hear, I got more Traherne in the course of the essay. But since this was the first context in which I read Traherne in the first place, the context in which she places Traherne in her essay was, for me, the context in which I encountered Traherne. I had no other place to put him. Now, at this point in her essay, she simply quotes him. She goes on to comment later. And let me give you the context in terms of the other quotations. In fact, this passage from Traherne is the first in a sequence of, that's one, it's the first in a sequence of, they're not the first, it's the penultimate in a sequence of 10 short quotations. I don't know, I won't read more, I'll only read something. So before I got to the Traherne, I read a series of other things, of which the Traherne was almost the climax, not quite, it was the penultimate. And in all of these, Dorothy Sayers was trying to say, look at these different experiences, I think there's something common in them. And I'm going to tell you what it is. She doesn't tell you first, she just asks you to read them. Let me just give you a sample of some of the others. The first one, she says, let us begin by bringing together a few examples drawn from the most diverse sources, in fact and fiction, in order to do that. Examples of a certain kind of experience about which she wishes to write. Let me give you the ones that led up to the Traherne for me. The first is from the book of Exodus, chapter 3. Now Moses came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight. And of course, then God calls the messes out of the bush, ablaze, but not consumed. So that was the opening salvo. She took me to Exodus. Then she took me immediately after Exodus. The second example is from Dante, from the Vita Nuova, from Dante's account of encountering Beatrice, when they're both quite young. Dante's younger than I was when I read this, when he saw Beatrice, and she quotes, rather amazingly, she quotes in Italian, expects you to understand it. So my 17-year-old self had to run off and get the Temple Classics edition of the Vita Nuova and find it. So I could say, vede perfettamente ogni salute che la mia donna, cioè la donna, and go on to speak of di bella grazia a Dio. I'll be merciful and I'll give you that same Temple Classics creed. He who beholdeth my lady amongst other ladies, beholdeth perfectly all saving power. They who go with her must thank God for his great grace, gratia. Give thanks. So this is the vision of a girl, which is the vision of much more than a girl. It's a kind of influx of joyful outpouring of grace. And then immediately after that, she gives me Blake. And again, a passage of Blake that stayed with me ever since I read this essay. It's a crucial passage for me. It's from Blake's A Vision of the Last Judgment. This is Blake. What, it will be questioned, when the sun rises, do you not see a round disc of fire, somewhat like a guinea? Oh no, no. I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. Do you visions around this of fire, somewhat like a guinea? The innumerable host crying, holy, holy, holy. And then, straight after Blake, so think about this, we've had Exodus, Dante, Blake, then she takes us to the gospel. And where would she take us? Of course, but to the Feast of the Transfiguration. And he was transfigured before them. and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. Then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. And she continues with various examples. And then there's one still before we got to the Traherne, which I have to say pierced through to me. You have to remember, I was reading this in, must have been 1974 or 5. But I was still the tail end of hippiedom, and I was following the big poets and listening to the Grateful Dead and reading Ginsberg, but also reading Huxley and The Doors of Perception. And lo and behold, right here in this essay, Dorothy Sayers, of all people, puts in, after the Transfiguration, she puts in this passage. Plato could never have seen, as I was seeing, a bunch of flowers shining with their own inner light, and all but quivering under the pressure of the significance with which they were charged. Could never have perceived that what rose and iris and carnation so intensely signified was nothing more and nothing less than what they were, a transience that was yet eternal life, a perpetual perishing that was at the same time being, a bundle of minute, unique particulars in which, by some unspeakable and yet self-evident paradox, was to be seen the divine source of all existence. And then amazing passage, Huxley. Supposedly not believe at all, which, as he says about this experience, words like grace and transfiguration came to my mind. And this, of course, was what, among other things, they stood for. So that's from Huxley's famous book, The Doors of Perception, itself quoting Blake. If the doors of Blake said, if the doors of perception were like cleansed, we would see all things as they are eternally. And then a couple of others. Then finally, pen up there, that passage, the court was orienting the modern weight. And then she put just one more piece in. And you'll recognise this. She puts this little piece of Wordsworth in. Wordsworth not looking into the present as all the other writers were, looking wistfully back. There was a time when meadow, grove and stream, the earth and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. So, astonishing, as I said, you must imagine my 17-year-old self reading these great passages in sequence. What was Dorothy Sayers up to? Well, she was trying to establish by all these different witnesses that this transfiguration, this experience for which words like grace and transfiguration were the only possibility, this sense as Traherne said, of all things abiding eternally as they were in their proper places, eternity manifest in the light of day. That this was not an isolated, private, small, rare, subjective experience for one or two people that happen to be that way, but something to which all the ages and a wide range of writers could witness. But of course, she was subtly saying their archetypes, their very cores, are there in the scripture. The burning bush and the transfiguration. Of course, all the early church writers saw the burning bush and the transfigurations in some sense the same thing. They saw that all the commentators, in fact, God writing up into the Reformation, and Calvin says this in his commentary on Exodus, that the burning bush is necessarily the type of prefiguration of the coming of Christ, because the natural nature of the bushiness of the bush, if you like, remains rooted in the earth in all its bushiness, and yet it is filled with the eternal flame, the flames of the eternal splendour. So in Christ he has the two natures, humanity and divinity, and his divinity does not consume or burn away his humanity, but shines through it. So the burning bush is the type, and of course it's from the bush that God says, I will come down. That is the kind of promise of Christ. So when Christ reveals the light of the divine nature on the Mount of Transfiguration, it is, in a sense, a fulfillment of what the burning bush is. And that's why Moses is there. So look at it. In a sense, it's the same event. But by placing those alongside Dante, Traherne, Blake, and then, surprisingly, Huxley, as you know, was experimenting. He was just trying to see what the effects of psychoactive substances were. And this is pre the 60s boom in them. But he was experimenting with mescaline and trying to see how the mescaline that was used in Navajo indigenous religion. And later in the essay, Dorothy says, discusses how even if the experience is first given through some psychoactive substance, the question remains whether it was first given through a psychoactive substance or given by the hours of first love. The question is not what caused the experience, but where does it lead you? What do you do with it? How does it deepen you? Does it begin to be a way, a via? Or is it just a one-off thing? Does it dwindle into a mere indulgence or recreation? Or does it become part of the pilgrim path? That's the question she wants to ask, and of course by including Huxley, she's able to ask it in quite a sharp and contemporary form. So what is she up to? She's trying to establish what she calls the via affirmativa, as opposed to the via negativa, the way of the affirmation of images, which is necessarily the way of the poet and artist, the way of the mystical poet and artist, as opposed to the way of the negation of the images, that is to say, the cloud of unknown, the darkness of the divine, which is the way of the contemplative mystic or of the ascetic. And she took that distinction between the two ways and also a further distinction on the affirmative way between the first image, that first experience, and subsequent loss and recovery and maturity, which she calls the second image. She took both the distinction between the way of affirmation and the way of negation, and in the way of affirmation, the journey from a first image to something more. She took both of those distinctions from the writings of Charles Dickens, and particularly from his book, The Figure of Beatrice, which is what got her going on Dante and led to the great translation. And she contended with Williams that in the theology books and the general works on mysticism, because they're all written on the whole by people trained in the via negativa and writing about mystics and saints who practiced ascesis in monasteries or hermitages and said of every image, I must forsake you because God is more. Rather than saying, you are one, though only one of the myriad things will tell me a bit more about God. I mean, Williams used to bring the two ways together and say of every image, this also art thou, neither art thou this. But because Williams and Sayers both contended that because the bulk of, at that time, it's changed now, but at that time the bulk of books on mysticism or even on spirituality, not a word much in use there, were written by practitioners of the via negativa. The via affirmativa, the way of the affirmation of images, got very little area, and some people were unaware of it even as a possible way at all. But it is not only the only possible way for the poet, who must necessarily work in images, it is also the way which, for many of us, may be the best one to follow, precisely because we don't have the luxury, if you can call it luxury, of living on a tiny island off the west coast of Ireland, or walling ourselves up in as anchoresses in a little cell in Norwich. We can't do that because the kettle has to be boiled and the children have to go to school and the grandchildren have to be looked after. We dwell amongst the images. But is there a mystical way for us? Is there a way of the affirmation of the images? Dorothy says, thinks that there very much is. So in the course of this brilliant essay, she sets out some of the implications of acknowledging the via affirmativa and following it as a genuine spiritual and mystical path. And she gives helpful advice, I think, on what it means to follow it to its fullest and most fruitful conclusion. And in the course of the essay, it turns out that for Dorothy says the two great heroes and exemplars of the affirmative way are Dante and Thomas Traherne. And the counterfeit, who shows us what it might mean to have that first image but then to lose it, not to be able to follow the way through, to somehow enshrine the image in the past rather than letting it call you from the future. The person who she feels sadly does that, although writing brilliant poetry along the way, is William Wordsworth. Indeed, she begins the entire essay by asking the question, why did Dante keep his inspiration and why did Wordsworth lose his? You might put it even more sharply, why at the age of 46 was Wordsworth writing like an old man and Dante at the age of 56 writing like a young man in the first flush of love as he sees Beatrice in the paradise. So, we must first understand what she meant, of course, a little bit more of what she meant by the affirmation as a mystical way, the way of affirmation as mystical. Her first contention is that Dante's experience of overwhelming bliss, of transfiguration and grace, on seeing Beatrice and receiving her salute. Salute, of course, in Italian means not only greeting but salvation, which is very convenient for the poet. That Dante's experience of Beatrice's saluting, which leaves this overwhelming sense of grace and charity, is not so rare as we might think. It's rare that it's so beautifully expressed, but it's not so rare that it's actually experienced. And further, as that list of experiences that she did suggest, she didn't think that that rapture, that bliss, was confined simply to those who happened to have fallen in love. And she felt the gift of this transfiguring image could happen in all kinds of contexts, not simply in those of personal relations. Now here, having read you the things she quotes, I want to read you just a passage of the essay itself, in which she defines, I think very beautifully, what the via affirmativa is and how it might be followed. So this comes immediately after her list of 10 that started with the burning bush and ended with the ode on intimations of immortality, and had that great Traherne passage. This is what she says. Now, all the experiences thus described, whether they belong to fact or fiction, are in the proper and technical sense mystical. What is experience is the immediate and intuitive awareness of an eternal reality. It's the common denominator. The thing which they have in common and which distinguishes them from mystical experience of the classical type is that everyone has a basis in the world of physical phenomena. There is no imaginary vision, still less that total naughting of all forms and images which characterizes the mysticism of the negative way. What is behind is the transfiguration of something actually existing in the outer world of sense. There is an actual bush which burns and is not consumed. Beatrice and Pompilia are women of flesh and blood. The human body of Christ is present upon Mount Tabor before, during, and after the vision of his divine glory. Blake's sun is the sun of astronomy, and Huxley's flowers stand in an ordinary vase upon a table. Wordsworth's meadow, grove, and stream are geographically located at Cockermouth. The children who play are those who play in the streets and fields of Traherne's native town. The physical bases are very diverse, but the quality of the experience is everywhere recognizably the same. We cannot separate it arbitrarily into erotic, religious, and nature mysticism. We could indeed say that it's all nature mysticism, if we mean by that that it has its basis in the natural order. But the phrase is not ordinarily used in that sense, so to use it would, I think, be really confusing. I have preferred to call it, this is the title of the essay, Dorothy says, I have preferred to call it the Beatrician vision. Not because it is by any means always concerned with man's love for woman, but in honour of Dante, who was the first, and is perhaps still the only writer, to have systematically charted the mystical way, which leads from the vision of Beatrice to the beatific vision. That's wonderful. I love that, the vision of Beatrice. And that's the point. The point about all of this is not to have a series of nice, strange, mystical experiences that you sort of reflect on afterwards and keep to yourself and do nothing about. But this is, you are on your way to the beatific vision, to the complete vision of glory and plenitude and glory and plenitude in response to it from you. But you'll get in these little. It's rather to say, I mean, it's not in the shoes, but it's in the shoes. I used to think these moments when they happen, and they happen quite rarely, but they're glorious when they happen, as being like random flecks of gold suddenly coming into the kind of ordinary walk and weave, the sort of, the sort of dull and weathered tweed of life. Suddenly, there's this fleck of gold. What Dorothy says is saying, and what she says Dante demonstrates, and what she also sees in the arc of Traherne is that they're not random pinpricks of gold, they're a golden thread. They're woven behind everything, and each one that you have is actually connected to the previous ones and leading to the other ones if you're left. And I think, of course, when I think of this as my image, but I realise that image of my own came from that. I mean, so many things do. I give you the end of a golden string, only winding heat through a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, fast in Jerusalem's wall. So she says that she gives the honour to Dante. She wants to call it the Beatrician vision because he charted the way from the vision of Beatrice to the beatific vision, which is how he said it. And then she says this, which is both a kind of note of warning and a challenge. She goes on to say, and it must be said that not all who have enjoyed that first vision go on to follow that the way, and that of those who do, not all attain the end. But among those who have attained, we may reckon, wait for it, Dante and Blake and Traherne. Those three, she says. And it's just, well, you can imagine, again, I think I have to think back to it was years later when I finally tracked down a copy of this book. I had it from my home, but rereading this essay actually in preparation for speaking to you made me realise how deeply it had sunk into my mind. How many things I quote, how many thoughts I think was just as my thoughts, because they're just unhabituated to actually come out of this essay. But you can imagine what, a page or two before, I'd never heard of Traherne, I just read this one bit about the Orient and Immortal We. A couple of pages later, Dante and Blake, who we have there, we're going, there are three people who've achieved this mystical way, Dante, Blake, and Traherne. You can imagine how focused I then became. Well, I better find out a bit more about Thomas Traherne. So, there's a huge amount going on in that passage I've just read, more than we can pursue in the course of a single lecture. It would be interesting if we do this, you read the lecture yourself and follow it, when she wants to give this example of how one turns aside from the way. I mean, some of it, she doesn't even think it's worth pursuing why people turn aside from the way. If Huxley has a drug experience and doesn't follow through, that's his issue. She's much more concerned with Wordsworth and with what Wordsworth does with the experience of loss. It is not now as it has been before. And she thinks there's a tragic, an understandable but tragic element of locating, even though those first visions were vouched in childhood, just as they were vouched in childhood to Traherne, of locating them in the receiving past alone, rather than in the future. So we could follow that, but I'm not going to have time to follow all through the things she says about Wordsworth. But I think we will try and just follow in the time that remains a little of how she traces the journey from the first vision to the final vision in a kind of parallel between Dante and Traherne, as I say, particularly because this is Dante's year. So the first thing she says in the essay about Dante's vision of Beatrice as the archetype of all these mystical experiences, the Beatrician vision, including the archetype in a sense of Traherne's, is that it is not inward-looking and private. It is not, in any sense, self-indulgent or subjective. On the contrary, the vouchsafing of this first vision gives rise to a new vision of the whole world and to an overflow of charity to others. So she gives a beautiful summary of the kind of thing Dante says in the Vita Nuova, which is the book in which he accounts for how he first met Beatrice and how that changed his life. So she also says, and I found this so comforting and helpful when I read this essay, that look, it's not just the odd extreme poet who has this experience. It's actually quite widespread. That not only helped me personally, but it helped me enormously in being a chaplain over these last 20 years at Cambridge. Because I'm aware that students were, just throw this in. I sometimes think that those of us who are chaplains or spiritual directors or who are known to our friends to be pursuing a spiritual life and to perhaps know a little bit about it and be able to offer some advice. We now are in a position very similar to doctors or physicians in the mid to late 19th century among the middle classes. Now, in those Victorian days, everybody had other parts to their body apart from the feet and hands. All these parts were covered up, and everybody, in fact, had a sex life, but they couldn't possibly talk about it. Whether it was going well, whether it was going badly, how it affected them, it just wasn't there. Except when they talked to a doctor. When a woman went to see a doctor, she could talk about these things and these parts of it, and the doctor licensed her, in a sense, to have that conversation. Now, by contrast, she could talk about her prayer life, and we have a complete taboo about death and grief and bereavement, and the Victorians did that very well. But they were completely repressed as it happened, or at least the middle classes were about sex. So that's part of life. Well, active, vigorous, as important as it's ever been to human beings, was simply silenced. Now, I think we've been living through a period in which it's exactly the same thing as having a spiritual life and prayer life. And that you need somebody who's licensed to say, how's your prayer life? Had any visions recently? And I found that I could give students, the classic line was, I'm not religious, but, and all kinds of things. Later on, I did a poetry with a friend of mine who's a chaplain in mental health services in Cambridge. We were working on what with people who've been experiencing, both depression and some psychosis, and we were doing a poetry group with them. And this was the first time I heard from one of the patients the distinction between religion and spirituality. And this woman put it very straight as a person who was recovering from very long, deep bouts of depression. And she said, religion is for people who are afraid of going to hell. Spirituality is for people who've been there. But also for people who've had glimpses of heaven. So I sometimes find that I can just give people permission to talk about their hidden spiritual life. And then sometimes I can offer them a bit of vocabulary, some imagery with which to articulate. And it's real, and it's going on. But it's been suppressed, they just haven't had a chance. It's been too embarrassed to tell anybody else about it. Extraordinary. So, Dorothy says, This was just so refreshing. Let me read to you again from this essay. Moments of Beatrician vision are experienced by a great many people when they first fall in love. Intimations of the eternal realities may occur at the psychological level, or may even, as in Aldous Huxley's experiment with Mesmer, be artificially induced. In a morbid form, they sometimes appear as features of certain mental arrangements. When, however, they occur spontaneously to healthy people, and this is beautiful, this about not being in the room. When they occur spontaneously to healthy people, they tend to induce, if only temporarily, that condition which is theologically called being in a state of grace. Sono tenuti di bella grazia a Dio rende mercede. Words like that, so she's quoting us the beat in the road. And then she quotes Huxley. Words like grace and transfiguration came to mind. Then she says this: Dante has left us with the best of all accounts of this state of grace. He says that at the prospect of receiving Beatrice's salute, which means not only salutation but salvation, he was taken hold of by such a flame of charity that he forgave everyone who had ever offended him. And if he'd been asked any question whatsoever, could only have answered love with a countenance clothed in humility. Meekness within and an overflowing of charity to those without are thus the signs of this gracious state. And where they are present, there is the assurance that the vision is a true one, and that we have to do, not to do merely with aesthetic pleasure or with the lust of possession. The soul adores and loves. It prostrates itself before a fellow creature whose bodily presence is somehow felt to be a vehicle of grace. And the image of a greater reality that informs and indwells it is the eternal truth of its being. Extraordinary, right? So you're not seeing something that's not there when you see the transfigured person. You're seeing actually things as they really are. You're seeing more truth rather than less truth. So she goes on to ground that vision, as she's described it, even more deeply theologically by quoting a key passage from Charles Williams' brilliant book, The Figure of Beatrice. So here is Charles Williams giving an even sharper theological commentary on what happens at the Beatrician vision. Again, this is the example of Dante, but you could all apply this to passages of Traherne that you love. You could certainly apply what Williams says about Dante's vision of Beatrice to the passage we just heard from the Centuries of Meditations. This is what Williams says. What Dante sees is the glory of Beatrice as she is in heaven. That is, as God chose her, unfallen, original, or if better, redeemed, but at least either way, celestial. What he sees is something real. It is not realer than the actual Beatrice, who no doubt had many serious faults, but it is as real. Both Beatrices are aspects of one Beatrice. The revealed virtues are real, so is the celestial beauty. So, in other words, he's seeing her for a moment subspatiate eternitatis. And that, of course, is exactly, precise theological language, what Traherne says about his vision of the Oriental immortal reed that the boys and girls claim. He says, I knew not that they were born or should die, but all things abided eternally as they were in their proper places, as it were, seen in the light of heaven. But then, having established, as it were, the verity and the eternal grounding of this first image, this moment of vision that you have, she goes on to deal with the challenge of loss, the sense of fall and breaking away and veiling and obscuring, the awful experience that you sometimes have after you had such a vision, which Eliot summed up. She was quoted here. Eliot summed up so beautifully in just that line. After he's gone quick, now, always, and then he goes, ridiculous, the waste, sad time stretching before and after. But what you do with that apparently waste, sad time, how do you work through it? How do you not lose the thread? How do you recognise that there is a thread, even if it's now behind, tweezed, or it's not come out yet? So that's what she attends to. The loss of the first image. There is a quest for recovery. There is a need to journey through the images into the divine, to recover from those times when we saw the person as an icon, to recognise that in our fall and theirs, the icon has, as it were, dwindled into an idol. But it is possible for it to become an icon again. Now for Dante, the experience of the loss of the first image was quite literally the loss of image, the death of Beatrice. The experience of recovery was the writing of the Divine Comedy. And he said at the end, and it has to go down, as John of the Cross said much later, the way down is the way up, You may remember at the beginning of the comedy, he sees a city and he tries to get up the shouting island by himself. And it's the leopard, the lion, and the wolf stop him, and the Virgin stops him. The Virgin says, no, you've got to go down first, you've got to see what becomes of the images if you keep them to yourself, if you seize them, if you convert them into you, rather than letting them convert you into God. This is the way it goes down the spiral, and you need to recover and purge up the counter spiral, the beautiful, having had the vicious circles of hell, you have the virtuous spirals of purgatory. Then, when you've danced through that refining fire, you'll see Beatrice again and you'll be ready to recover. It's not, think how he could have done. He could have just been endlessly nostalgic for that moment in Florence. When they were both 9 and then when they were both 18. But he didn't. He said, no, she's still in heaven somewhere, I'm going to move forward. So, for Dante, this experience of loss was literally the death of Beatrice and the working through. And having written about that, she then turns again to Traherne. And this is what she says after kind of giving some account of Dante. She says this. And again, of course, she was writing this, it was published in 1963, she would be writing this in the late 50s, maybe early 50s. But of course, a huge amount has happened in Traherne, studies and scholarship, not least the discoveries of Jeremy Maule, who commemorated this lecture and did these images on. So you may be able to come back on this, but this is in terms of the sources she had at the time of this essay. Traherne also experienced the loss of that first intuitive vision, though in a quite different way. His own account of himself is very remarkable, for he claims that his conscious memories go back almost to the moment of his birth. I believe that many psychiatrists would agree that this is not impossible. But the content of his memory is, to say the least of it, very un-Freudian. It's an understatement if there was one. For it includes no birth trauma and no longing to retreat into the womb. He says that he remembers a state of pure paradise of happiness, like that of Adam before the fall, going back to the time when he experienced only a simple awareness, without any clear distinction of the senses. And then she quotes the preparatory of that lovely poem. My body being dead, my limbs unknown, before I skilled to prize those living stars mine eyes, before my tongue what cheeks were to be shown, before I knew my hands were mine, or that my sinews did my members join, when neither nostril, foot, nor ear as yet was seen or felt or did appear, I was within a house I knew not, newly clothed with skin. Then was my soul my only all to me, it's very low, a living endless eye, just bounded with the sky, whose power, whose act, whose essence was to see. I was an inward sphere of light, or an interminable orb of sight, an endless and a living day, a vital sun that round about did ray, all life, all sense, a naked, simple, pure intelligence. For sight inherits beauty, hearing sounds, the nostrils sweet perfumes, all tastes have hidden rooms within the tongue, and feeling wounds with pleasure and delight. But I forgot the rest, and was all sight or eye, unbodied and devoid of care, just as in heaven the holy angels are, for simple sense is Lord of all created excellence. Amazing. She goes on then to make some comparisons between that and Wordsworth's poem about heaven lies about us in our infancy, and Wordsworth says of his own childhood. But then she goes on to look for what she thinks is the Trahernean equivalent of the death of Beatrice for Dante. And this is what she says. Like other immortal things, these are the impressions of immortality that Traherne says he had in his childhood and even before his birth. But like other immortal things, they had to die and rise again. Traherne, always precocious, tells us in the 3rd century of his meditations that his apostasy took place as soon as he was brought into contact with the worldly standards of his teachers and playfellows, whose hearts were fixed on tops and gewgaws, on, quote, ambitions, trades, luxuries, inordinate affections, casual and accidental riches. That's a pretty good summary of the content of most newspapers and magazines. It's about covers the basis. Anyway, that's it, it's invented since the fall. It would have been easy, he says, to teach him otherwise, but nobody made any effort to bring his first innocent apprehensions into any kind of constructive relation with the worship of the God of nature. So that before long, again quoting Traherne, my thoughts, as indeed what is more fleeting than a thought, were blotted out. And at last, all the celestial, great and stable treasures to which I was born, as wholly forgotten as if they had never been. And he is persuaded, and here she quotes again from the Centuries of Meditations, that our misery proceedeth 10,000 times more from the outward bondage of opinion and custom than from any inward corruption or deprivation of nature. And that it is not our parents' loins so much as our parents' lives that enthralls and grinds us. You can imagine this was meat and drink to a rebellious 17-year-old in the 70s. Yet, is all our corruption derived inasmuch as all evil examples and inclinations of the world arise from sin. But I speak it in the presence of God and of our Lord Jesus Christ. In my pure, primitive virgin light, while my apprehensions were natural around things, I cannot remember that I was 10,000 times more prone to good. I cannot remember that I was 10,000 times more prone to good and excellent things than to evil, as the original blessing for you. So she points out that Traherne experienced this apostasy in his loss and had to recover. And she looks at Traherne's recovery of vision and again makes telling comparison with Dante. Dante had to learn in a new and deliberate and intellectually rigorous way to enter again into the vision of truth, which had been vouchsafed to him so clearly and graciously as she gift in the vision of Beatrice. So too did Traherne. And then she has a series of short quotations, which I think are really telling. She said, for Traherne, we have nothing which, so far as we know, was actually written at the time of the change era. This is the recovery to the new vision that path we do now. We only know that when he thought what he thought when he looked back on it from the height which showed the whole of his past was clearly displayed before him. 4 phrases, as Dorothy said, sum up Traherne's mature judgment. To live the life of God is to live all the works of God and to enjoy them in his image. These clear satisfactions were the emanation of the highest reason, but not achieved till a long time afterwards. That's really interesting. They were given. But they're constant the reason. They can be worked towards again. They can be recovered by thinking clearly. As a child, I knew by intuition those things which since my apostasy I collected again by the highest reason. Wonderful healing back together of intuition and reason, imagination and reason. With much ado I was corrupted and made to learn the dirty devices of this world, which now I unlearn and become as it were a little child again, that I may enter the kingdom of God. Well, time is rushing by. I'd like to finish there, if I may, with the very last words of Dorothy's essay. She goes on to make many more direct comparisons between Hereford and Traherne. But she returns to the sense that the way of affirmation of the affirmative has been neglected, though it has in English literature, these two great masters, Traherne and Blake, and in world literature it has. And she finishes not with a look back to, gee, I wish I'd been in Traherne, I wish I'd been in Dante, I could have been in Florence, which would be the kind of words living approach. She actually finishes with a call and a challenge, and I think reading this, 1963, so I'm not good at maths, but that's, what is that, that's 40, 50, 60 years ago, nearly? 50, 58 years ago. Something like that. So a lot has happened since then. This is what she said all those years ago needed to happen. And I think actually a great deal of it has happened and is happening. But a great deal more of it needs to happen still, this is what she says. And yet the way, the via affirmative, though neglected and overgrown, has not been left wholly unsheltered. Dante is its pioneer, Blake its prophet. Traherne has supplied it with a manual of devotion. Charles Williams has outlined its theology. But it needs more scholars and historians, and I would add more poets and painters, stories and musicians. It needs more poets. It needs more scholars and historians. And this is perhaps as good a reason as any for commending it to the notice of the universities. I've been trying to commend it to the notice of the universities in a quiet way for the last 20 years. But of course, Jeremy Maule did that supremely before me. I remember gathering with several others in Trinity College at the memorial, and it's what an extraordinary trying and generation after generation of students, probably one of the last of the dons that gave his all in individual situations to students rather than just, writing books for AEP. And yeah, so Dorothy says call for this, and it's happening, and I'm sure you as the Traherne Association